Well, hello there, it's Antrice, and welcome to another episode of the Savvy Painter podcast. You know, until I started my own podcast, I had no idea how much work it takes to keep one going. That's why so many podcasts disappear so quickly. Did you know that the average podcast lasts less than 6 months? And even when you include mega hits like NPR's Serial or This American Life or one of my favorites, On Being, all told, the average podcast gets less than 300 downloads per episode. Savvy Painter averages more than 7,000 unique downloads. And there's even some that are 25,000. Apparently, I'm doing something right. And look, I know it's not perfect, but I have somehow managed to keep this podcast going for more than 4 years by myself. I am no Ira Glass or Terry Gross, but did you know that they have an average of 15 to 20 people working on each episode, doing research, coordinating guests, creating graphics, writing scripts, keeping the website up, keeping the technology working, handling promotions and social media and marketing, and still responding to listeners? They have a whole team working behind the scenes so that the host can focus on the interviews. Guess who does all of that for Savvy Painter? I do. It's me, all by myself. It's a lot of work. They also have people who edit the podcast, handle the sound engineering, write the show notes, upload the final episode for distribution, and upload and publish all of that to all of the podcast channels and the website so that listeners can just click a button and hear an episode. I work with an amazing company called Podcast Fast Tracks who does all of that for me. And thank God, because if I didn't have them, I would be curled up in a little ball in the corner of my studio. Point being, there is a ton of work that you never see, and it's not cheap. It costs about $1,000 a month to keep Savvy Painter going, and that's because I do most of it myself. My guess is you had no idea what happens behind the scenes to make sure that you get an episode every other week without fail. I had no idea either before I started, which is probably a good thing. So I'm asking for your help to keep this podcast going. A small monthly donation makes all the difference. It's just the price of a cup of coffee or a single tube of student-grade earth tone paint. I'm not talking professional cadmiums or cobalt violet or anything weird like that. Just the most basic burnt umber. Just a small donation like that from you would help a lot to keep this podcast going. You can make a difference. At a minimum, I would love it if I didn't have to explain to my accountant why I'm still doing that quote-unquote little podcast. Go to savvypainter.com/support. Big or small, your contribution matters. Thank you so very much. This week, my guest is Maggie Siner. Maggie is originally from New Jersey, but now lives in France. In this episode, we talk about the language of painting. Maggie describes how mastering our materials allows us to make statements and express ourselves with conviction. She shares what she learned from early mentors about the infinite possibilities of a brushstroke and how none should be taken for granted. Everything from the consistency of the paint to the pressure of the hand and the mood of the artist affects our brushwork. After decades of painting, Maggie can look at her students' work and point out exactly when they were bored, when they were excited, when they were filled with joy, or when they were just dialing it in. Maggie studied with the artist Robert de Artista, who she credits with teaching her what it really means to paint and how the painting actually begins at the edges of the canvas. Maggie shares how moving to France pushed her beyond an intellectual understanding of Impressionism into a visceral understanding of it, and how she incorporates that into her own work. Here is Maggie Siner. Maggie, thank you so much for being on the Savvy Painter podcast.
It's great to be here.
Will you tell us a little bit about yourself? What made you decide to become an artist?
I'm not sure I ever really decided to become an artist. I'm not sure I've decided yet. But when I was young, I drew like most children do, and I guess I was good at it. So everyone in my family decided that I was an artist. They kind of gave me that hat. And I remember, I liked to draw. I was the quiet child. I was more of the observer, and the rest of my family were very loud. I had four brothers and sisters. So they dubbed me the artist, but I don't think I had any idea what that meant. It only meant, for example, in junior high, when we had to take a second language, my brothers and sisters all had to take Latin because that's how you become a doctor or a lawyer. But I was told to take French because I would be an artist. So I studied French, which of course came in very useful when I moved to France many years later. But anyway, I wasn't really interested in art. If we ever went to the art museum, I looked at the mummies. That was my main thing. Mummies and hieroglyphics, mostly liked. But my parents were supportive in the sense that they sent me to art classes when I was in high school. I went to the Art Students League on Saturdays. So I grew up in New Jersey in a fairly intellectual family. So they let me take the bus into Manhattan to study at the Art Students League. And I did take a class there. That's when I first painted from the nude. But I really wasn't that interested in painting. I was much more interested in going down to Greenwich Village and going to the be-ins and, having a psychedelic time. It was the hippie time and, or going to political protest marches and things like that. So I don't think I suppose my interest in art was more in commercial art. I like to make album covers or book covers or portraits of, Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment, that kind of thing. But nothing. I had no romantic notion of what an artist was or that I wanted to be one or anything like that. And I certainly never thought of it as a career.
What changed? What changed your mind?
I was lucky to get into Boston University because I was a very, let's say, a sloppy student in my senior year of high school. And I always thought I would go to RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, because I was born in Rhode Island. But I didn't get in there. So I got into Boston University, which was really perfect for me because it was a really, really serious school. At that time, this was in the early 70s. It was probably the last bastion of really traditional art education, where you draw 6 hours a day, every day of the week, for 2 years before you're allowed to touch color, for example. You learn to grind your own paints. You learn the chemistry of paint. You learn what is permanence in materials. We took anatomy, full years of anatomy. I had a great anatomy teacher, Jack Kramer, who wrote a wonderful book. I had a great materials and techniques teacher, who was Reed Kay, who wrote another wonderful book. So I got very serious at that school. It was really disciplined, hard work, and I was successful. I really liked it, and I learned all about art history and other artists. And now, as a traditional school, it was still the 70s. There were lots of things going on in the contemporary art world, but at Boston University, we didn't acknowledge much past early Matisse. It was very figurative.
Uh-huh.
That just suited me just fine. And I guess even then, I thought I would go into commercial art because you have to make a living, right? I don't know. That was just an assumption that I would always do something graphic or commercial. But in my, whatever that year was, I guess it's junior year, you had to pick a major. And all my teachers went around saying, okay, what are you majoring in, painting or sculpture? And I said, no, I'm majoring in commercial art. Oh, that's impossible. You're much too good for that. Commercial art was really poo-pooed. It was seen as inferior. The department was in the basement of the school. And, the other art courses were on the 4th, 5th, 6th floor, whatever it was. So I went home to my parents and said, I'm going to major in painting. And my father had a fit and said, like hell you are, I'm not paying for your education, so you can starve in a garret. And, this whole story. So back I went to school and I said, I can't do that. I'm going to major in commercial art. And they all went to bat for me, all my teachers, because I was a very good student. And, teachers like to help their students. They wrote a letter to my father inviting him to the school. And we went up to Boston and they went into some room, a bunch of short Jewish men all got in a room together. And when they came out, I was a painting major. And when I think back on it, I feel certain that they hit him in his soft spot. They just probably said, well, you won't get your money's worth if she goes to the commercial art department, because those are the worst teachers and that's the weakest department. And, if you're going to spend all this good money, you might as well get the best education for her and yada, yada, yada. So then I became a painting major. But I mean, I was perfectly happy I loved painting. I loved sculpture. I loved commercial art. I loved all of it. But anyway, so that's why I say I never really decided. It's kind of the world made a path for me. And once the path was carved out, just kind of the way your brain functions, once you do something enough times, it just becomes you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
And then I had a wonderful time at working in BU, and I learned a lot about the pursuit of excellence and mastery.
Ooh, yes.
And things that really stick with me forever. In fact, I remember the first day of college, of art school, and they gathered us all in the auditorium, and they told us that, we were the select whatever. They just say that to make you feel good. And that they were going to prepare us for a productive middle age. So, when you're 19, that is the most ridiculous thing you could possibly hear. Middle age, we'll all be dead before we're middle age. What does that even mean?
Right.
But it turns out to be very true because most of my classmates are still practicing artists and quite successful. And they did, what they meant was they're instilling work habits and foundations that will keep you in good stead for the rest of your life.
What would you consider some of those habits that they taught you that gave you that foundation that you're talking about?
Well, that you work all the time, that you don't wait for some kind of inspiration or feeling. It's a lifelong activity. You can continually improve if you work hard. That your materials, that your respect for the materials equals the quality of your work and your self-respect. So treating your materials well and understanding your materials. In other words, if you don't know your materials, all you can do is express how you can't express anything because you don't know anything about your materials. I'm not talking only about the technical aspect of materials. I'm also talking about handling of materials and your personal relationship with materials. Just like a musician, after years and years and years, the violin is part of their own body. They have a mastery over the violin because it's become part of their own body. And that kind of mastery, it's not just knowledge that you can get from reading Ralph Mayer, which everyone should read, but it's also...
That's the properties of artistic materials?
Yeah, the materials and techniques for the artist. Yeah. I guess, we didn't really have a kind of a romantic idea of the artist, but on the other hand, it was certainly never seen as a profession, I'm making hand quotes here, or a career where you would earn a living. It had nothing to do with earning a living. It was, you make a life. Painting is your life. It's not your living. So, they're very foundational properties that have stayed with me forever. Somewhere along there, I guess it was, I don't forget which year it was, I got a scholarship to go study in Tanglewood for the summer. At the time, Boston University had a summer program in Tanglewood. They have a music school there in Tanglewood. So sometimes they also had a painting program there. And that year, I also had to have a big run-in with my father because he didn't want to pay for that. And I was supposed to earn money all summer, so rather than go off painting. Anyway, to make a long story short, I met Robert DeRista, who was my mentor. He's a great, great painter. And much as I love all my teachers at Boston University, DeRista was this colossus compared to everyone I'd ever, every teacher I'd ever had. He was so brilliant and so erudite, and he saw painting as something, it was almost as if they saw everything in black and white, like the beginning of The Wizard of Oz.
Mm-hmm.
And when I met DeRista, the world turned into color. Painting just became something completely different, which is, it was not colored drawing. It's a different language entirely. It's the language of paint.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit for, maybe people who are still living in black and white, or maybe just monochrome? What were some of the things that he turned you on to or showed you that made that really hit home for you?
It wasn't only about color. It was about the transformation of materials. I mean, he was an abstract expressionist. He came out of the abstract expressionist school. And a painting is a collection of colored shapes on a flat surface. It's always abstract. There is no such thing as painting that's not abstract, because all it is a bunch of colored shapes on a surface made out of some greasy paint.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not they eventually recall something from the real world or not, that's whether we define it as figurative or non-figurative. But the reality is it's just some colors on a flat surface. And those color shapes, every mark, every brush mark, every touch, every color shape is interdependent on every other one in tension, in pressure, in speed, they all have they're structured on a kind of architecture of one shape against the other, or one stroke against the other, or one form against the other. And that's the language of painting. It's like music. Music is very abstract. You just hear notes. You don't necessarily hear words. Sometimes you have words too, but it's the notes that are communicating the content. So it's the abstract structure of color and shape, the abstract arrangement of color and shape, that really creates the meaning of the painting, not the narrative. If the narrative were the meaning of the painting, then we wouldn't be able to look at 150 different enunciations, because they're all just enunciations. But each one says it differently because it arranges its colors and shapes and forms and the paste of paint and all the aspects of painting in a different way. So, he taught me so many things.
Yeah, no, this is great. I love it.
The application, or what I call the delivery, you've got the paint on the palette and you work very hard to mix a color that is exactly 1 micron this way and 1 micron that way. And then you've got, the aha moment of, this is exactly the color I want. And then you pick it up and it has to be exactly the mass of paint that's correct. It can't be too thin. It can't be too thick. It has to be exactly that right amount of density. And then you have to make the delivery. And the delivery is a form of touch. It's like massage. It's how are you touching? Are you going to bump into bricks like Cezanne? Are you going to caress something very gently like Vermeer? Are you going to scream and yell like Soutine? There's just so many different ways of applying the paint, of delivering it from the brush to the canvas. And that also it's just a profound aspect of how a painting expresses itself. When I walk around the classroom when I'm teaching, and I can walk up to any painting or any painter and say, okay, here you were bored, here you were interested, here you were really excited. I just read it in the brushwork. Why don't they know that I can see that? Of course you can see it. It's in the paint. The delivery, the human touch has carried your intent, your sensations, and your feelings. So, you have to pretend to be interested even when you're bored, because you have to convince, your gesture has to be convincing.
Yeah, you have to paint with conviction.
Yes, with conviction. Okay, that's a good way of putting it. With conviction, or with some kind of content. You have to have some kind of content, some kind of emotional content, or some kind of, it's very kinesthetic, but I don't like the way people sometimes want to separate the scientific words from the art words. But if you think of it as touching someone you love, there's a lot of different ways you can touch someone. Well, it's the same thing with how you deliver paint.
Mm-hmm.
And that delivery, it's not just a delivery, obviously, when you're painting. It's a whole battle. You put it on, you take it off, you move it here, you move it there, you take it off again, you put it on again, you get furious. It's a whole theatrical production from the beginning of the painting to the end of the painting. We should all be so lucky that you just put it down and it miraculously lands there right, and then you can go home.
Wouldn't that be nice and boring?
Yeah. Anyway, D'Arista was a brilliant, brilliant man, and he died quite young. So I was very lucky to study with him. I studied with him in Tanglewood, then I followed him to American University. I was his teaching assistant for 2 years. So I worked very closely with him. He also had a lot to say about the structure of the rectangle, or whatever the shape we're painting in.
The canvas itself.
Yes, the architecture that's inside, sort of the dynamics of the shape of the canvas itself, regardless of what's in it. It has its own dynamics. So you have to we live in the world of gravity. Gravity is in the painting too. It's in us, it's in the painting, it's a fact of life. And the way our eyes function, the way our eyes focus on things, the way we land on edges, the angular movements of our eyeballs and all that, this has a lot to do with how we move inside a rectangle. There's a lot of physiological reality to how our eyes take in a painting or move. We don't look at a painting in one shot because it takes you a while to look around and see what it is. But your job as a painter is to make people go around inside the painting and never to leave the rectangle. You want them to stay inside your painting. You don't want them to leave the rectangle and go look at the next person's painting. No, you want to entrap them inside your rectangle. Well, okay, I'm being facetious here, but it's a stage. It's a stage. And on this stage, something's going to happen. Something's going to start. Somebody's going to walk on. So the painting always starts from the outside edge, from one of the outside edges, of which there are 4. If it's a rectangle, okay, if it's a triangle, there are 3. If it's a circle, you know what I mean? They're different shaped canvases. But wherever it is, it starts outside, and then you enter somewhere. And then this is the beginning of the story. Once upon a time, and then you send, with those shapes and those marks, you send the viewer on a journey inside that rectangle, working with the internal forces of the rectangle itself.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
It does. And it's so exciting to be able to create that space and that world, so to speak.
Yes.
So how do you use that in your paintings? That idea of constructing the space from the outside edges, but bringing the viewer in and entrapping them is a little bit, but it's true. We want them to stay. We want them to stay in the painting.
Well, I'm being a little facetious there, but it's not so much. Okay. Making space is part of painting. And the space, it's true that the space is at its flattest at the edge of the rectangle, but I wasn't really thinking of it necessarily in terms of space. I'm just talking about the abstract storyline of the tensions and what's going on. In other words, to me, that's the language of paint. And that's really what I suppose that maybe all painters come to that, but it was Derista who introduced me to that. And so I attribute that to him, but probably all painters come to that at some point.
How did you come to live in France?
Well, after graduate school, I came to Europe to basically just to see all the paintings. I had studied, I was quite enamored of Cezanne, but and Vermeer and Rembrandt. So I'd studied a great many painters, and a lot of the paintings didn't travel, particularly the frescoes. And I'd also done a lot of specialization in early Italian fresco painting. That's what I did my thesis paper on. We had a big art history requirement to get an MFA at American University. So I had to go on the Piero della Francesca trail and see every single one of his paintings and all the Giottos and all the Massachos. And, I had a pages and pages list of just about every major museum in Europe and every chapel in Italy, or particularly Tuscany. So, I went off with my easel and I landed in Aix-en-Provence because not only was that the home of Cezanne, but I happened to have my younger sister was there studying French. And so we were going to travel together all around Europe. So that's how I landed in France. I really didn't speak very much French, and I was very happy to be in Aix-en-Provence and to discover immediately that Cezanne made nothing up, that the world looked exactly the way he made it.
Oh, wow.
The Sainte Victoire in every little brick of paint, that his need to measure the spaces of things with those short little sensations, those little strokes. The world looked exactly like that. And it also looked exactly like Bonnard. It was much too bright and colorful. From a girl from Boston and New York, to be honest, I couldn't even paint at the beginning because the colors were so bright and saturated. The light was so bright. The colors were so intense that I painted after the sun went down. This was in the summer. It was July. So the sun goes down at 10 o'clock at night, actually. But in the town, the sun is low on the horizon at maybe 6. So I could paint from, say, 6 to 10 because in the direct sunlight, it was much too bright. Nothing on my palette. It just made no sense. I couldn't even see it. I had no idea how to paint it. So first I painted at night, and then I this is an aside, but my sister played the fiddle, the bluegrass fiddle, and she was out there at the outdoor cafes, playing her fiddle and passing the hat and earning money. So when I came, we did this together. And since we'd grown up singing these very simple, stupid camp songs our whole life, we had a lot of songs in our repertoire that we could do blindfolded. The kind of songs where you go, shave and a haircut, 2 bits, these stupid little back and forth things. Anyway, and she would take out her fiddle and she'd go, this orange blossom special kind of thing. And hundreds of people on the Cours Mirabeau in Aix-en-Provence at, these enormous cafes, they'd all prick up their ears and say, what's that? And because at the time, all the street musicians, and there are many, because people go in the cafes at night and they sit there and, they expect to be entertained. So there were a lot of street musicians, and they were all pretty much long-haired hippies. I mean, they were singing Bob Dylan songs, and there were maybe some good jazz players, but it was a lot of folk music. And then along comes these 2 little girls wearing dresses, and my sister with her, that piercing violin sound. And we're singing Oh, Susanna. And, anyway, we made a fortune. Because French all thought we were authentic. Oh, say authentique. It's authentic. It's like 2 little Jewish girls from New York singing, "Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb?" Anyway, we made a fortune. We had a blast. But that's just as an aside. The real truth is that I got a teaching job very, very soon after arriving there, because I just happened to run into the director of the Institute for American Universities in Aix-en-Provence, whose art history teacher had gotten pregnant, and the class had to be in English. And I happened to meet him, and at that time, MFAs were a dime a dozen, and I probably never would have gotten a job in America because the competition was really fierce. But I got a job teaching there, so that was, I knew I would have a job in September. So we stayed during the summer and played, but when September came, I had to stop playing in the streets because I didn't want to, be a beggar passing the hat with my students.
Be busking and having your students come by.
Yeah, no, that would be too embarrassing. So anyway, eventually I figured out how to paint in that light, but it was a really slow process of basically reinventing Impressionism, which I knew all about Impressionism.
Interesting to say that you were reinventing Impressionism where Impressionism arguably started.
Well, it started in the north of France, because Cézanne is a post-impressionist and Van Gogh is a post-impressionist. So mostly they were, in a little bit more in the north of France. But I guess the interesting thing is that you can learn things intellectually, but then when it comes to applying them paint is a different language. Okay, so then I met a boyfriend, French guy, moved into this windmill. It was built in the 1700s or something. It was a stone windmill, no water, no electricity. We had this hippie life of, goats and ducks and all that. But anyway, I painted the Mont Sainte-Victoire, which was in front of me every day, a different view from Cézanne's. And he was a blacksmith. He would bring me these warm bricks to stand on in the winter so I could have my feet warm. Anyway, I would look up at the sky and say, yes, it's blue, but it's got a little pink in it, but it's got a little yellow in it. So you mix blue, pink, and yellow on your palette, and you get a disgusting shade of gray, right? Back you go. Okay, I'll try that again. There's blue, but there's a little pink, but there's a little yellow. And so as I went over and over this so many times, and, the sky was not an ugly shade of lead gray. The sky was luminous, but it had all those colors in it. So I saw one day, just out of pure frustration, I put the blue down in a bunch of spots, and I put the pink down in a bunch of spots, and I put the yellow down in a bunch of spots. And I had reinvented optical mixing, which, of course, I just slapped myself on the side of the head because, of course, I knew that.
But you had to experience it yourself. I mean, that's what I think is so interesting about the idea of reinventing Impressionism, because you can intellectually know something, but you can only really, I think, understand it when you are in that place and you have to do it, which is so exciting.
Exactly. I had to figure it out. It never entered my head to think, well, what would Seurat have done? It didn't.
Right. Right. No, you're painting, you're there as Maggie Siner, not as Surratt. So you're discovering this maybe with some of that knowledge. And then you have that aha moment of that's how you get that. And that's why they did it. And here's how I'm going to do it.
It makes you feel really stupid, though, because you already knew this for years. You've known this. So and then I lived in France for many years. And ever since then, I guess I spent 5 years there. I had my first job there. I had my first shows, my first one-person show there. I guess that was the beginning of my adult life, was in France. And that really does mark you a lot. I mean, since then, I feel like an alien in America, because although I do go back to America, those are really foundational years in your adult life.
Yeah. Yeah. It's when you're developing yourself,
Exactly.
You're away from your parents, you're away from that influence, and you have to take everything that they gave you and discover who Maggie is.
Well, plus you're in a new culture, you're in a new language. I mean, this was a time where no one spoke English there. There was, it wasn't tourist land.
Yeah, and there's nothing like being dropped into that makes you really question who you are. I think I had a similar experience in Argentina, where I kind of dropped in and had to learn the language and go through maybe something similar.
Well, it's wonderful. It makes you a very rich person. I mean, since then, I've lived in China, I've lived in Italy. They're all transformative experiences. You can't go back to being a one culture person after you can't unknow things the way you see. But anyway, while I was there, I did go to see all the frescoes and almost all the museums and all the paintings, because Europe is relatively small once you're there. So you can get around quite easily. And I was very lucky to see those things then, I have to say, because back then, you could stand in the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua for the whole day after day.
And they wouldn't kick you out.
No, and now it's cleaned and it is magnificent. It's restored. It's beautiful, but you can only have 20 minutes and then you're hustled out with your group, and that's the end of that. So, I was very lucky to be with all the Piero della Francesca frescoes and, places where you had to really go out of your way to find them. And
yeah, I've done that trail and it's incredible. And you do have to go out of your way to see them, but so worth it. Can you describe, for somebody who's never seen your work before, can you describe your paintings? Tough question, I know.
A picture's worth 1,000 words.
It is, and I know for sure they will all go see your paintings, but, as they're listening to it, it sort of puts everything in context.
I suppose. I mean, I really, really dislike when anyone starts to describe their paintings to me, my brain shuts off because it's not a world of words. It's a visual world. And I don't like classifications either because they're, first of all, they change meaning all the time. So what we call impressionist is not what they called impressionist. It's the meaning has changed so many times that it just has no meaning. So if I have to, first of all, I'll just say I paint from life. I always look at what I'm painting. I paint while I'm seeing it. And that's all I do. I don't use photos. I don't make things up. I have no imagination whatsoever. The whole experience of painting to me is extracting some meaning from the chaos of the world around me. And I'll say the visual world, but the visual world is not a cold and distant place. In other words, vision is not a cold and distant sense. Everything we see is because it's our individual brain that is seeing it. Vision is very subjective. Any, 5 people looking at the same thing are going to tell you something completely different. So I think it's a very subjective and emotional world. So I paint from life. The quote unquote subject or the thing I'm seeing could be anything. It could be anything large, small, near, far, because I'm only seeing shapes and colors anyway. So I don't think about things in terms of their nameable object qualities, like this is a bottle, that's a bowl. I don't look at them like that. I look at them in terms of color and shape. So if people want to categorize as the landscape, the still life, and the figure, I do all those things. But I think they're traditional divisions. But basically, they mean the landscape is things that are far away or bigger than us. The still life is things that are close by or smaller than us, and figure is us. And that basically covers the whole world.
That is one of the most descriptive interpretations I have heard of someone describing your work. Because of course I've seen your work, but it's beautiful, Maggie. That was perfect.
Thank you. So in general, I don't look at things that are already beautiful, generally speaking. If something is beautiful in life, it's probably not going to make a beautiful painting, because part of what's beautiful about it has to do with life and not vision. If I can, I don't know that I can add anything to a sunset or fireworks if I paint them. It's just going to look worse, or even flowers. If something is absolutely exquisitely beautiful, my painting will be less than. But my job is to look at the corners where nobody looks and make it more beautiful. So if I can bring something wonderful to a part of the world that nobody paid any attention to before, then I have contributed to the sum total of beauty on this planet, which is a good thing. So my subject matter, quote unquote, could be anything at all. Could be, right now, lately I've been painting these really ridiculous porcelain cherubs that are balanced on golden balls. I mean, they're the most kitsch, corny, ridiculous thing you ever saw. But I don't know, for some reason they got into my paintings. Another thing I'm doing a lot of is beds. I like drapery a lot because drapery captures movement that happened in the past. You know what I mean? If you throw a towel on the chair and it lands and it describes both the chair and the throw that got it there, it kind of captures time, and it also captures weight, which is to say gravity, which is the force that we live under all the time. So, and drapery on people or off people. Well, when the drapery or it's a dress or something, clothing is off the person, there's still the form of the person in there often. So it captures something that happened before in a still moment of now. I just find thrilling. And it's also the shapes and tones and color juxtapositions and value changes on drapery. It's just the most beautiful thing in the world. So recently I've been painting beds the last couple of years, unmade beds. It's not a subject I ever thought, I never had an idea in my head, ever. Never had a concept or an idea like, oh, maybe I should paint such and such. Never happened. Everything I've ever painted has come from opening my eyes and looking around and saying, well, what should I paint today? And I look around and sometimes things jump out at you. So one day, this was in my apartment in Venice, and I had a big guest room, and I have several large rooms, and the doors, they're like 3 meters high. They're enormous, and they open up the rooms. And so I had opened up the doors of the guest room, and the guest had left, and the bed was unmade. There was just a pile of bedding on the bed, and it happened to be under these huge windows, and this beautiful light fell on the bed, and it looked like, I don't want to say an altar, but it was the most beautiful thing I ever saw. And I said, oh my God, that's a painting. Because probably never in my life had I been far enough away from a bed, because a bed usually fills up the whole bedroom, right? So you can't step back and actually see it to paint it, because you're either in it or getting out of it.
Right.
I could open the doors between these 3 huge rooms. So I was really far away, and I saw the bed from a great distance. That's what I mean, like looking up at the altar in a church where this light is beaming down on the altar or something. And there was this magnificent bed, and it was all unmade sheets. And I've been doing that for about 6 years now, because
I can see how that would be so fascinating. Like, if I just think about, it's interesting. I usually, for example, I wake up usually about an hour or two before my husband does. I'm just an early morning person. And later on, like, I can tell what kind of like morning it was by walking back in. I mean, there's always a story there, right? Like sometimes it's
Exactly.
Yeah. Sometimes it's been made, like either he or I went in and made it. Sometimes like he maybe slept a little bit too long. And so the way that the sheets are thrown, I know he jumped out of bed really fast and had to leave. And then other times it's like a hot night. So they're pushed down at the bottom of the bed. And yeah,
exactly.
There's
and
so many stories.
You put one thing in that bed. Like one day I said, oh, I'm lonely here. This bed is just like empty bed. And I went down there was this little market in the square, and I bought something. It was a stuffed animal. It's just a teddy bear. I just stuck it in the bed. Oh my God. That changed the whole storyline of the bed. There's a child in the house now. And so, I could put a rose, a cup of coffee. And also I could change the colors of the bedding, and that changed everything because white is the most magnificent thing there is to paint. And if you change the color of the bed, of the blanket, then that changes all the colors on the white. All the shadow colors change. And so I could put a different color blanket in there because my landlord said they had a big cabinet filled with different color blankets. Anyway, I'm still not bored with that. You can throw an article of clothing on the bed. And then, I don't compose a narrative, but the narrative is automatically in there because we all spend a third of our life in a bed. And so we all have, you're happy, you're in love, you're sick, you're dying, there's so many intimate things happen in a bed. I don't do any of the narrative work. My narrative work is all in the shapes and colors, but everyone who looks at them delivers their own narrative. And to me, that's really rich. I'd say most of my subjects, I don't have a narrative. I just found something that was rich enough that there are narrative options in it.
Yeah, you set the stage and allow the viewer to bring in the actors.
Yeah. Well, any two objects that you put together are already a narrative. Even one is a narrative. But as soon as you put one thing next to another, one of them is taller. Mm-hmm. One of them is, There's immediately, how far apart are they? Are they kissing? It's just human nature to anthropomorphize everything. We anthropomorphize everything, or at least I do. So if I have, a pen and a bottle on the table, I'm going to make up some whole scenario about the pen is going to stab the bottle, or, it's impossible not to read them as characters.
Absolutely. As you're talking, I'm just looking around at my desk, and there are easily 30 or 40 stories just sitting on my desk based on what objects, without moving anything, what objects are just alone on a canvas, what are together. Do you pan out? All of that. In one glance, I can see about 15 to 30 stories.
And the narrative just comes from the shapes. It's the way the shapes distribute the objects. I guess the negative shapes, the background shapes are really the painting. In most paintings, it's not the so-called things. It's the empty spaces that are most of the real estate, if you will. The most of the area of the painting are the non-nameable things. And so they really are the painting, not the nameable objects. Those are just like the salt and pepper. The real meat of the painting is in the negative shapes or background shapes or the non-nameable shapes. And those are what really make the narrative. The objects themselves are usually static. They don't have movement and gesture, and they tend to be more regular. And well, I guess some of them have gesture because my little cherubs have a lot of gesture. And also my newest one is this little plastic pink flamingo. I have painted toys a lot in my life because it's kind of human-like. We're very likely to anthropomorphize and read a narrative in toys, and we have a whole association with them. But particularly now, because I wake up every day and try not to think about the state of the world or the state of my country. So I've lost myself in, these fun and ridiculous creatures where I can, spend my time in a fantasy land.
I'm currently reading this book that is incredibly deep and dense, I should say. So it's kind of like as I'm listening to you, there was a point in this book that would take me like 20 minutes to explain, so I won't.
What's the book?
Oh, God. Okay, so here's my excuse part. So I saw this book and I was looking through on Audible, I think it was. And when I looked at the title, I immediately dismissed it because red flags went up and I went kind of in my head, I went BS. That's going to be really kitschy, not interested. And the title of the book is The 12 Rules of Life. And so I immediately went, oh God, another one, right?
Right.
And then what was interesting, it was on Audible and it had something like 12,000 5-star reviews. And usually like books on Audible are about 500 reviews. This had 12,000. And I was like, what?
Yeah, you have to pay attention to that.
Yeah. So I got it. And the book is nothing like what I expected it to be. Very dense. I have to listen to one chapter and then turn it off and go for a walk or something because it just gives you a lot to process. The question he sort of posed was, can you live in a world of reality, like see things for what they are and choose to create beauty in the world, I guess, choose to have the faith. And so I think what you said earlier about creating beauty and, understanding that there's a lot of chaos in the world right now. And what is the role of a painter in that? And what are we what are we bringing into existence? And how is it impacting everybody else? Super deep question.
Well, I mean, the world is always chaos.
Yeah.
It's not anymore. It's like we live in a world of chaos and our brains are designed to figure out some kind of order out of that chaos. That's what our brains do. Because I don't think there is such a thing as reality outside of us. There is no such thing as objective reality because we don't know what's out there. We can't see what bees can see and what bats can hear and there are trillions of neutrinos going through your body every second. There's a whole world out there that we have no sense organs to perceive. So what the world out there is, we have no idea. We only have our 5 little sense organs. And, the one I like is the eyes. So we just have to take what comes in through our eyes and make some order out of that chaos. And that's what we do as human beings. And that's why a painting that can make some order and some meaning and some sense out of chaos feels convincing, because that's what our brains do. That's what we're trying to do all the time. That's the human mind. That's life. So I don't know. There's a lot of art, contemporary art, that celebrates randomness, chaos. I won't say irrationality because we're all irrational anyway, but you know what I'm saying. It's like the world is already random and chaotic. So what? The job is find something meaningful and beautiful in it. That's an accomplishment. And that's what mastery is, I think.
Beautifully said, Maggie. So, last question. What habit do you have that you feel like contributes to your continued growth as a painter?
Let's see, persistence. No, I mean, basically it's, it's hard work. It's not about self-expression. It's about trying to be a better painter. It's a consistent work. And I don't mean that in any painful way, but you paint, you get up and you paint, even if you don't know what you're going to paint or feel like painting, you just do it anyway, because most of the ideas come out of, and we already said this, I'm not someone who waits around for ideas. I don't have any ideas, but I do paint all the time. So there's always something, you can just look around and find something and find some arrangement of shapes somewhere. And then when, you start to look and you find something and then you get to work. And if it doesn't come out to be anything, it doesn't matter. You're still at it, because painting only comes out of painting. It doesn't really come out of ideas, at least not for me. I've never been an idea person. I mean, I'm a very verbal person, but I think that the words are not painting. They come afterwards.
Right. That's beautifully said. And I think that when people run into problems painting, it's because they're trying to solve the problem in their head and not on the canvas.
Well, often, but painting is hard. So, painting is very easy when you don't know how. It's really easy at the beginning because you don't know anything. And then when you learn how, it's really, really hard. That's not very encouraging.
It's true. And I think it is encouraging because for the people who are struggling through that and think, why is this so hard? The answer is because it is hard.
Yes, I had a student once at the Washington Studio School, and it was a drawing class. I think it was just a beginning drawing class, but she came to me after a couple of weeks and she said, I have 3 PhDs, and this is the hardest thing I've ever done.
I believe it. Maggie, thank you so much for all the time that you've spent with me, and a very fascinating and entertaining hour that we've just had together.
Well, it was really great talking to you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Maggie Siner. Show notes for this episode are at savvypainter.com. Just click on the podcast link. As always, you'll find links there to all of the artists mentioned in this episode, examples of Maggie's work, and how you can connect with her. So until the next time, this is Antrese Wood with the Savvy Painter Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.